All right, if you have your Bibles, you're going to be turning to Psalm 19. Psalm 19 is where we're going to begin here in just a few minutes. Unlike Ben, you all don't know me as well, so I'm not going to sit here and go through all these like really sweet words but I'm thankful to be here, and I'm thankful to spend time with you all. And even if I had been here, like at home, that's just not my personality. I feel sweet things, but I don't express them very well. And so imagine all the sweet things are being said right now, like right now as you're turning to Psalm 19. It is a blessing to be here, though. I don't know all of you, but there are some faces, some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a few years, and I see, and I'm just really happy to see some people. I keep pointing at Ethan Shutt. I love Ethan, and he's here. I didn't know he was going to be here. I got to see Olivia. I know her as Olivia Doris, but I know she has a new last name now, so I don't know what that is. Okay, I thought somebody was going to help me. But it is good to be here. It's good to be here for a lot of reasons. There's not just to see people that you like, and maybe see people that like sports teams that they shouldn't like, but it's good to be here in all honesty. Because everything that we do has one singular purpose. At least it should. That everything that you do and everything that you are is really with the aim of serving God and of pleasing God. Or maybe as some scriptures would say, of living in such a way where you glorify God. I'll be honest, I was 14, I think. I'm pretty sure I was 14 the first time I opened the Bible in my life. The thought of the word glory just made no sense to me. That's like a Bible word that you only really hear whenever you're around other people that are talking about Bible things. No one ever talks about glory or what glory means or glorious, unless you're talking like in a sports thing and it's like the glory. But no one really knows what the word means. And no one really knows how it's supposed to be used except for if you go to Scripture. And this past weekend, what we were able to do is spend time with some of the young kids. I think it's really important. I told the young kids I wasn't going to rag on them and look at them kind of like, y'all are terrible. But they're not terrible. I don't know why I said but there. But they're at an age right now that I think the 13 to 18 are in a lot of ways the age that kind of forms who you end up being. And so the fact that you would spend time this weekend hearing two grumpy dudes talk about social media says a lot about you. And that you came here again this morning says a lot about you. And parents, for you to keep in mind that where your kids are right now in their life is a critical moment. It's a critical time. And so I would encourage you to talk to them about what they talked about this weekend, to formulate plans to better work on being people who glorify God, on better being people who serve God, and that they might have some things that they can help you with as well. And so I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for Lauren and Jared for hosting us, the Nixes. I know that we made them stay up well past their bedtime, Jared for sure. But they were very gracious. I'm thankful to the Kellers and having all the kids over, the Coffees, having all the kids over. Jared and Chad for setting everything up the way that y'all did. Jarrett and Chad setting everything up the way that y'all did was really encouraging. And it would not have gone as smoothly, I believe. I'm confident if Ben and I set it up by ourselves. And so just to have all the organizing and all the planning, I think made it go very well. And so all the thanks, all the good stuff, we're going to get into the lesson now. But I feel like that's important to say in this sort of moment. So, all right, Psalm 19. We're going to put some verses up. We're going to talk about the glory of God. And as we talk about the glory of God, I want us to think about something for a second. Everything that has ever been created says something. You say something, whether you say something or don't. Your life says something. Creation says something. What everything is saying something about God. In Psalm chapter 19, the psalmist begins, and really the purpose of the psalm is to talk about the law of God and the law of God being able to restore people and save people. But I want you to notice how the psalm begins in Psalm 19. Psalm 19, starting in verse 1, it reads, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. The line has gone out through all the earth. and all their utterances to the end of the world. In them he has placed the tent for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of the chamber. It rejoices as a strong man to run his course, and its rising is from one end of the heavens to the other, and in its circuit to the other end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. I want you to consider, just as we begin here, this idea of Psalm 19 and how God relates to his creation. There's going to be a point in kind of how we talk about ourselves and us being to the glory of God. But in Psalm 19, as the psalmist begins, I think one of the things he's trying to help us understand is that the heavens, creation, they're saying something. That when you look at the world around you is telling something. It's speaking. It's almost like you just imagine the world is shouting at you. And what I like is he says that the heavens are telling you without telling you. It has no voice to speak. It can't utter words, but it's still saying something. It says the heavens are telling, the expanses are declaring. And what is it, according to Psalm 19, that the heavens are telling? He says the heavens are telling of the glory of God. That their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. That night to night, the idea there is that every single night, it is saying something. It is revealing knowledge of who God is. That their line is uttering these utterances to the ends of the world. And so you get this picture of what creation is doing. That as God thinks about his creation, you may even think about like why God created his creation. The purpose of it, what does God gain of creating all these things? God created things so that the things that he created might say something about him. Not so that it would say something about themselves. That's oftentimes how we as the creation behave. But God created all things so that creation might say something about him. So that creation might talk about his glory. That creation might talk about that as creation just exists, that it would show the work of God's hands. That it would show it night to night, that every day this is what it's doing. And that it's doing this from one end of the earth to the other. That as God thinks about his creation, again, that God uses this creation to proclaim himself, to proclaim his goodness to all peoples in all places. And this isn't always in just the things that you say, but that your life would be as such that it proclaims something. We talk about sometimes glorifying God isn't just when we sing, we will glorify. And when you glorify God, that your life, even without utterances, even without words, that your life is supposed to say something. That it's supposed to say something about God. And not just here, but to all peoples of all places. That your life is supposed to say something about the Lord. That whenever God thinks about his creation, that God uses his creation to constantly affirm itself. That from the rising on one end of the heavens and the circuit on the other end, the idea is as the sun rises and when it goes back down, God is constantly affirming himself. He's constantly saying who he is through his creation. When you think about your life, do you think about your life in this way? Do you think about your night to night and day to day in this way? Maybe ask yourself this question. When God thinks about you, do you think that God sees you fulfilling this? You are a part of creation. As a part of creation, are you someone who's announcing something about God? Which, by the way, you think about like what creation announces. Go back to Genesis 1. You don't have to, we're not going to do it now for the sake of time, but read Genesis 1. What is Genesis 1 saying about God? It's saying that God is all good, that God wants to have a relationship. He creates, that God is wise, that God is perfect. That's what creation is saying about God. So again, whenever you think about your life and your day-to-day, is that you? Do you talk about God, whether in your words or in your life? Are you proclaiming God to all peoples? And are you doing that constantly? Are you telling the glory of God? See, glory is a weird word. And there's a lot of different definitions that people use to talk about glory. There's one in the Old Testament Hebrew that I really like. I didn't put difficult there because the word is difficult to define. That's just one of the definitions that gets used for glory. But the idea of weight, I think, is the best. Whenever I think about glory, and the best way of defining the word glory, I think of a weightiness. The opposite of glory, I think biblically, is vanity. You know, whenever something is vain, it's empty. You can have a hot air balloon, and the hot air balloon looks huge, but how weighty is that hot air balloon? It's just filled with air. You could have a bowling ball that looks a lot smaller. Think about how heavy, or you think about like a ball made of cement. It's a lot smaller, but you think about the weightiness of it. When we think about the word glory, I want you to think about this idea. Just consider this idea in your mind. That when I think about glory, I am thinking about a weightiness. And so whenever we talk about God being glorious, that God has all glory, this is what we are saying, is that God is weighty. That everything that God does, that everything that God says, that every aspect of who God is, there is no hot air in that. You ever talk to somebody, met somebody, you're like, that person is just full of air? That person's empty. Nothing they say actually matters. God is the opposite of that. Everything of God is glorious. Everything of God is weighty. And so this picture of all things for the glory of God, again, think about this idea. In your life, does every aspect of your life prove and show the weightiness of God? Or do you make God like that hot air balloon? Do you just make him empty and like hot air? At least because you call yourself a Christian and people are seeing you live your life. And they're seeing how you talk. And they're seeing how you dress. And they're seeing what you do on the weekends. And they're especially seeing you on social media. And they're seeing where your priorities are. It's not in God, it's in work, and it's in your money, and it's in the things that you build. They're seeing all of that. Are you giving God his proper weight? Or are you making him vain? It's interesting, people I think have always struggled with this. I don't think this is like a new 2022, whatever world we're in, that we're struggling with this. I think people have always struggled with giving God the proper weight that he deserves. And in Romans chapter 1, what God actually does is God says, let me outline for you why this happens. So maybe you're here this morning and you're thinking to yourself, I don't actually know. Maybe I'm trying to live for the glory of God, I think, or maybe I'm not actually sure if I'm living for the glory of God or not. But how would I know anyways? I think that in Romans chapter 1, what Paul does is Paul lays out, this is how you would know. Here's what happens. And so we're going to put the text up on the screen. Y'all should be able to, y'all could read that. But in Romans chapter 1, Paul writes, and starting in verse 18, he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what is made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, verse 21, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, verse 24, God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way, also men abandoned the natural function with men committing natural function of the woman, and burned in the same way, burning their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinances of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, not only do they practice them, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. You notice in the text, by the way, how that happens? How you get to maybe being someone who glorifies God, who sees God as weighty in your life. To maybe right now you're telling yourself, I don't actually always give God the weight that he deserves. I don't always give God the glory that he deserves. I think Paul lays out in these verses, like, this is how this happens. It doesn't happen overnight, by the way. You don't go from one day loving God and every aspect of your life is for the glory of God to tomorrow you're what he describes in verse 29. That's not like a, oops, I don't love God anymore. Like, that never happens by mistake. It's never a, oops, I'm no longer glorifying God anymore. That doesn't happen by mistake. Paul lays out, like Paul says, look at what happens. Notice where it starts, by the way, in these verses. It starts in verse 18 with people who've decided to suppress truth. By the way, you are living in a world, all of you, not just them. We are living in a world that more and more is seeking to suppress truth. What is truth? Is there truth? That's your truth. Maybe, I don't know. How can we know? How does anybody know? And that sort of mentality leads us to not glorify God in the ways in which we're supposed to. We have to see the danger in that sort of mentality that anything can be true and you just choose and it's whatever you feel. It's not whatever you feel. Feelings sometimes are stupid. Don't always go by your feelings. There is truth. And whenever we find ourselves not glorifying God, it's because it starts here. It starts with you know some things to be true, and what you've done is you've just pushed them down. You've suppressed those things. And he continues, because whenever you start suppressing those things, then you don't give those things the value that they deserve. So whenever you suppress the truth, where it naturally leads you to is it naturally leads you to not honor God or give thanks. You become ungrateful. And you keep going in the verses. You become ungrateful, and because you don't acknowledge the truth of God, you have to find truth somewhere, and you think that you are the source of truth, professing to be wise. They think they know so much. You go on social media, you go on the internet, and everybody's a doctor of something. You know what I mean? Like, YouTube has the answers from everything, and it's like guys like me who don't know anything. We're in a world that has so much information, and everybody thinks they have something worth saying, and they don't. Professing to be wise, they're fools. You want to know again, how do I get to this point where I don't acknowledge God, where I don't glorify God in the ways in which I'm supposed to? I suppress truth. I don't give God thanks, and so because I'm not giving God thanks, I'm going to find something else to give thanks. Professing to be wise, they became fools. And then it says, and here's where it happens. They think they're so smart. They think they have all these answers, and what they end up doing is they end up exchanging the glory of the incorruptible God for an image. By the way, if you spend more time on social media than you do in the word of the Lord, or than you do with God's people, or than you do with doing spiritual things, what have you done? You've exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for images. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And so is it a surprise then that this is what the world becomes? That women exchange their natural functions for things which are unnatural. And whether that unnatural be, like the text I think is laying out, homosexuality, or even in the world that we live in, transsexuality. Think about you've exchanged. Which, by the way, should you be surprised that the world that you live in is the way that it looks? That people are committing indecent acts. That people are living in this way, that men abandon the natural function of the woman and they burn in their desires for other men. You know why that happens? Because people profess to be wise and they're fools. Because people don't give God thanks for what He's created and the order and the structure that He's created. Because people have suppressed truth. And so then the world it creates is a world where people no longer see it fit to acknowledge God. And then they're filled with all these other things. By the way, have you ever thought about the list that he mentions here? That whenever I'm full of greed, I'm not giving God glory. That whenever I have deceit, it's not a full-on lie, it's just a little deceit, I don't have God's glory. That if I'm a gossip, I'm not glorifying God. That if I'm disobedient to my parents, that I'm not living for God's glory. That if I decide that I am going to live and I'm going to be someone who I'm just going to not have I'm going to choose to not understand some things, that I'm not living for God's glory. That if I'm someone who's untrustworthy, that if I'm unloving, if I'm unmerciful, that I am someone who's not glorifying God. Or maybe the most dangerous of all of these, maybe I don't do any of these things, but maybe I give hearty approvals, likes, to people who do these things. And if that's how I live my life, then I'm not giving God the weight that he ultimately deserves. See how dangerous this is? But do these verses at all, like when you read these verses, do these verses at all remind you of the world that you live in? Like when you look at social media, and be honest, you have social media. When you look at social media, doesn't it kind of look like this? When you talk to people, doesn't the world kind of look like this? Do you know why the world is the mess that it is? It's because people don't glorify God in the ways in which they should. And if we chose to glorify God, if we chose to give God the proper weight that he deserves, then maybe the world we live in would look a little bit different. But again, instead, we suppress the truth. We don't honor him as God. We worship things as opposed to the giver of the things. We equate his glory with truth and lies. God and the truth of God it's not like equal standing. It's not like I'm going to maybe choose the things in the world. I'm going to maybe choose what this person says. I'm going to maybe choose what my favorite politician says. It's like them or God. It's not the way it works. It's God and it's everybody else underneath him. There is no equating God to anything. And I'm saying politicians because I think maybe kids, I could say like your favorite social media influencer. But there's adults have things that they want to equate God's glory to. Nothing. Because when we do these things, this is where we find ourselves. You live in an unnatural way, or you give seals of approval to people who live in unnatural ways. Or maybe that you just try to find yourself receiving the glory that God ultimately deserves. All right, so what does a life look like? A life that's given to God's glory. What does that look like? The theme verse came from 1 Corinthians for the weekend for the kids, came from 1 Corinthians. That in all things that you do, whether you eat or you drink, do all things for the glory of God. And then you know what Paul says in chapter 11 and in verse 1? He says, therefore, be imitators of me, as I imitate Christ. You want to know how to live for God's glory? We can sit here for days and talk about that. Or I can encourage you to look at the one who perfectly lived for the glory of God. Maybe as John writes in John chapter 1 and in verse 14, when John says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. And the glory that he showed was the glory just as of the begotten, as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. That whenever John opens up his gospel, what he's saying is, he says, are you getting ready to see the life of a man named Jesus of Nazareth? And that whenever you look at his life, what you are going to see is you're going to see glory. And you're going to see it just like you were seeing it as if the Father was showing you his glory. And that as he demonstrates this glory, that this glory is going to be full of grace and this glory is going to be full of truth. You think about, all right, so how is he going to do this throughout the Gospel of John? How does Jesus demonstrate the glory of God? And you might think that like the natural inclination is to think, all right, he's going to show the glory of God, which means he's going to like go places and be like, hey guys, look at how awesome I am. I am Jesus and I am full of God's glory. Like that might be the temptation, right? Or be like, hey, God is glorious. God is glorious. And just say it like, notice what John says in verse 18. He says, no one has seen God, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father. He being Jesus, has explained him. I want to try to equate these two ideas, or to bridge these two ideas together. I think that one of the ways, maybe one of the biggest ways in which you will show the glory of God to the world, one of the ways in which you're going to be able to imitate Christ in the world is whenever you, like Christ, you, like the Son, explain the glory of God to the world around you. Think about how Jesus did it in his life. When you read the Gospel of John, one of the things that John does over and over again is there's this thread throughout the book where Jesus is talking about glory. And he's talking about this hour, stay awake with me here. Stay awake with me here. Where Jesus is talking about the glory of God. And think about throughout the book how he does it. He starts in John chapter 12. He starts at the very beginning of the book. But in John chapter 12, he says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And you keep reading in the book. And you're like, okay, he's about to glorify God, which means he's probably going to do this great, incredible, phenomenal thing. And in this great, incredible, phenomenal thing, God is going to be glorified. People are going to see it, and it's going to be incredible. And And like John kind of builds you up. So you're getting excited to see, all right, what's this glory going to be? And then in chapter 13 and in verse 31, he says, therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus says, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. Again, there's like this crescendo, this building up to God being glorified in Jesus. And you're reading the book and you're like, okay, how is this going to happen? How is he going to be glorified in him? Because I'm excited to see it, because if I need to glorify God, I need to do it however he did it. And so he says these things, and he continues, and in chapter 17 and in verse 1, he's praying, and he prays this prayer in 17 verse 1, and he just says, Jesus spoke these things, and lifting his eyes to heaven, he said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. In verse 4, he says, I glorified you on the earth, having accomplished the work which you have given me to do. So there's all this buildup to Jesus. He's going to glorify. He says, I've always been glorifying you, but Father, glorify me that I may glorify you. And there's this buildup to this one big event where Jesus is really going to glorify the Father. When you read the gospel, you know what happens next? What happens next is what Jared talked about this morning. What happens next is he dies on a cross. And as he dies on the cross in chapter 19 and in verse 30, he says, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. That at the very end, when he says, I've accomplished the work which you have given me to do, that in Jesus' mind, the work that the Father had given him to do was the work of demonstrating his glory to the world around him. You think about all the ways in which he did that. Father, think about for a second with me here, about Jesus' life. Jesus came into the world better than everybody else, by the way. He was. He's the Son of God. He came, and his birth was more unique than anyone else. He came, and he could do more things than anybody else could. He came, and he was smarter than everybody else was. He came, and he had more status, even though no one acknowledged the status, but he came of God. He came with more status than anybody else ever had. And how did he live his life? As a homeless man. Going from town to town, being around lepers and sinners, being around nobodies, healing people, serving people, and ultimately dying for those people. So whenever you think about how the Son glorifies the Father, you want to glorify God. You want to give God the weight that God ultimately deserves. You do it by giving yourself up. That in all things, that's the context of 1 Corinthians 10. Paul is saying to give up things. You really want to live a life that glorifies God. Don't consider anything you have to be your own. Your time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. Your kids don't belong to you. They belong to God. Your money doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. Your body doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. That in every single aspect of your life, that your life belongs to God. That you're seeing that whatever he wants is more weighty, it's more important than whatever it is that you want, than whatever it is that you think is important. That whenever you think about God's glory, I want to leave you with a few ideas here. That whenever you think about God's glory, that God is glorified when you give him the proper weight that he deserves in every aspect of your life. So in the way that you dress, let this be a question you ask yourself. Is God being glorified? Am I giving God the proper weight that he deserves? In the way that I dress, is God being glorified? In the way that I speak to people, am I giving God the proper weight that he deserves? In the things that I talk about with people, if you're going to have social media, in the things that I post, am I doing this to glorify God? Is this going to further advance the kingdom, or is this going to further advance me? That in whatever I decide to do with my life, if you're going to college and whatever you're looking to do in the future, in those things, am I giving God the weight that he deserves, or are these things being done for me, what I feel, what I like? That God is glorified when you decide to submit your will into his, demonstrating that he is the most important, the singular most important thing in your life. How do you show somebody? How do you show the world that somebody matters to you? I think you do it whenever you make sacrifices. I'm married. My wife, Heather, she couldn't be here. She was here a few years ago. But Heather gets treated different than anybody else in this room ever would, by me at least. Because I can say I love you in the Lord, but I love her a little bit differently. A little more deeply. And a little more, you would say a little more weighty. Now, there's things that I would do for her. There's things that I think about her more often, that things I'm willing to sacrifice for her, that I may not be able to do for any other person. But that I'm willing to submit things in my life to lift her up, to glorify her, to show her to be beautiful. And like, are you willing to do those things for God? Are you willing to give God the glory, the weight that he deserves? But I think you ultimately glorify God when you do what the Son did. When you lay your life down, that other people might see the grace and truth of God. That's what he did. He came and he lived and he died to show the glory of God. And what that glory was is that sinners, even like you and like me, can be redeemed. When you think about your life and you think about, am I glorifying God? Ask yourself this question. Today, have I laid my life down so that a lost world might see God's grace and God's truth a little bit better? Because that's what John 1:14 says. He came and he showed us the glory of God, full of grace and truth. Is that true in your life? Are you glorifying God in your life? I tried to not go bad cop. I hope this wasn't bad cop. I feel like there was a lot of bad cops this weekend. But I hope this stirs us on to think more seriously about your life, because every aspect of your life matters. Every single part of who you are, every single part of what you do, every second of your day matters. It really does. And how you use it matters. It really does. These things have eternal consequences to them. Like heaven or hell are the two options. There's nothing in between. And you may be fine, but are the other people in your life also? And if not, what are you doing to show them God? If you're not a Christian this morning, I would like to refer back to some of the things Paul says in Romans 1. That you are letting yourself be deceived. That you are allowing yourself to believe some lies. That you've exchanged the glory of the incorruptible Creator for things that are corruptible and for things that ultimately go away. And one of the beautiful things about God's glory is that if you're willing to admit your sin, and if you're willing to be baptized for the repentance and forgiveness of those sins, that you can change. Why don't you make a change today as we stand and as we sing?